Callum had seen plenty of rough nights in his life, but nothing compared to the storm raging outside as he locked up the small diner he owned. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling through the empty streets of the small town. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, ready to head home to his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, when he caught sight of a figure huddled under the awning just outside the door. A woman. She was soaked, her long dark hair clinging to her face, her expensive-looking coat drenched through. Her arms were wrapped around herself as she shivered, her eyes downcast as if she had nowhere to go. Callum hesitated for only a moment before exhaling sharply. "Hey," he called out. "You all right?" The woman's head snapped up, and for a split second he was taken aback. She was stunning despite the exhaustion in her eyes' high cheekbones, full lips, and a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, even as she stood there trembling. "I'm fine," she answered, though it was clear she wasn't. Her voice was soft but firm, like someone unaccustomed to accepting help. Callum glanced at the rain pouring down behind her. He sighed, already shrugging off his jacket. "Look, I'm about to close up, but you shouldn't be out here in this weather. Come inside, warm up. I can get you something to eat." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the empty diner behind him. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. "All right," she murmured, stepping inside. The warmth of the diner instantly enveloped her, and she let out a soft breath. Callum motioned for her to sit at the counter while he headed toward the kitchen. "What's your name?" he asked as he grabbed a fresh towel and handed it to her. She hesitated again before answering. "Ophelia." It was a beautiful name, one that suited her somehow. "I'm Callum," he said, moving around the kitchen with practiced ease. "You want coffee?" She nodded, wrapping the towel around her shoulders. "Please?" Callum poured her a cup and placed it in front of her before setting about making something warm. A simple grilled cheese and tomato soup, nothing fancy, but comforting. As he worked, he kept glancing at her. There was something about her, something that didn't quite fit. Her coat was designer, her boots looked expensive, yet here she was, alone in the middle of a storm with no car in sight. "You from around here?" he asked casually. Ophelia shook her head, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug. "No, just passing through." Callum didn't press. He knew what it was like to want to keep things to yourself. When he placed the plate in front of her, she looked down at it for a long moment before lifting her gaze to his. There was something unreadable in her expression, something almost grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. He shrugged. "It's just a sandwich." "No," she murmured. "It's more than that." She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Callum leaned against the counter, watching her curiously. There was a quiet elegance to her, something refined and polished, yet at the same time she looked lost. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked finally. She hesitated, and that was all the answer he needed. Callum sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I got a spare room at my place. It's nothing fancy, just a small house, but it's warm and you won't be stuck out in this storm." Ophelia stiffened. "I can't, it's not charity," he interrupted firmly. "Just a decent thing to do." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if she could trust him. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said. "Just for tonight." Callum grabbed his jacket and led her outside, shielding her from the rain as they made their way to his truck. As he drove through the dark, rain-slicked streets, he glanced over at her. Something about Ophelia told him that she wasn't just another stranger passing through. And he had a feeling this night was going to change everything. The rain had eased by the time Callum pulled into his driveway, but the night was still thick with the scent of damp earth. His modest home sat on the outskirts of town, a single-story house with a wraparound porch and a small, fenced-in yard. The porch light flickered as he unlocked the front door, pushing it open to reveal a warm, lived-in space. Lily's toys were scattered near the couch, and a few drawings were pinned to the fridge, proof of the life he had built for his daughter. Callum glanced at Ophelia as she stepped inside, her gaze flickering over the cozy interior. There was a quiet hesitancy in her posture, as if she wasn't used to being in a place like this. "You can take the guest room," he said, nodding toward the hallway. "It's not much, but the bed's clean and there are extra blankets in the closet." Ophelia nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you." Before she could say more, the sound of small, hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Her golden curls were a tangled mess, and her small face scrunched in confusion as she spotted Ophelia. "Daddy," Lily's voice was groggy. "Who's that?" Callum crouched down, brushing her hair away from her face. "This is Miss Ophelia." She needed a place to stay for the night. Lily's tired eyes studied Ophelia, then she turned back to her father. "Is she nice?" A soft chuckle escaped Callum. "I think so." Lily considered this for a moment before stepping closer. "Hi, Miss Ophelia," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Ophelia hesitated, then crouched to Lily's level. "Hi, Lily." The little girl studied her for another moment, then held out her stuffed rabbit. "You can borrow Mr. Whiskers if you're scared." Something shifted in Ophelia's expression, something almost vulnerable. She blinked quickly before offering Lily a small smile. "That's very kind of you." Lily yawned and leaned against Callum's side. He scooped her up effortlessly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Back to bed, sweetheart." As he carried her down the hall, Ophelia remained where she was, staring at the stuffed rabbit still clutched in her hands. By the time Callum returned, she had set it gently on the couch. "You all right?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. Ophelia turned, her expression unreadable once more. "Your daughter is sweet. She's my world." His voice was firm, unwavering. Ophelia glanced around again, as if trying to piece something together. "You live here alone with her," he nodded. "Since her mom left." Something flickered across Ophelia's face, but she didn't press further. Instead, she shifted, wrapping her arms around herself. "You should get some rest," Callum said. "Long day," a humorless laugh escaped her. "You could say that." He didn't push. Instead, he motioned toward the hallway again. "Guest room's yours for the night. Bathroom's down the hall if you need it." Ophelia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Good night, Callum. Good night." As she disappeared down the hall, Callum exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Something about her didn't add up: the expensive coat, the way she spoke, the look in her eyes when Lily offered her kindness. But whatever her story was, she clearly wasn't ready to share it. For now, that was enough. The next morning, Callum woke early, as he always did. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen as he moved through the quiet house. He half expected Ophelia to still be asleep, but as he rounded the corner, he found her already seated at the kitchen table, cradling a steaming mug in her hands. She looked different in the morning light, less guarded, though there was still something distant in her expression. "Morning," he greeted. She glanced up. "Morning." He grabbed a second mug and poured himself a cup before sitting across from her. "Sleep okay?" Ophelia nodded. "Better than I expected." Lily's voice carried from the hallway before she appeared, still in her pajamas. She climbed onto Callum's lap, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, is Miss Ophelia staying for breakfast?" Callum turned to Ophelia. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am," Lily grinned. "Daddy makes the best pancakes." Callum chuckled, ruffling her curls. "That's so," Lily nodded eagerly. "The best." With a shake of his head, Callum stood, moving toward the stove. As he worked, Ophelia watched him, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "This place," she said after a moment. "The diner, your home, you built all of it yourself." Callum flipped a pancake. "Yeah, took time, but I wanted something stable for Lily." A ghost of something unreadable passed through Ophelia's eyes. "Not everyone gets that," she murmured. Callum glanced at her, but before he could say anything, Lily giggled as she attempted to help set the table, her small hands carefully placing forks beside the plates. By the time breakfast was ready, the house felt lighter, almost warm. Lily chattered excitedly as she ate, and to Callum's surprise, Ophelia seemed to relax, even laughing softly at one of Lily's stories. But then, as the meal wound down, that guarded look returned. "I should go," she said suddenly, setting her fork down. Lily's face fell. "Already," Ophelia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Callum studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You got somewhere to be." She opened her mouth as if to answer, then closed it just as quickly. He leaned back slightly. "You don't have to tell me anything, but if you need a place to figure things out, you're welcome to stay a little longer." Ophelia's gaze met his, something unreadable passing between them. And for the first time, she didn't immediately say no. By mid-morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the world outside fresh and bright. Golden sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Callum had just finished washing up after breakfast when he noticed Ophelia standing by the front door, her fingers hovering over the handle. She had been quiet since their conversation at the table, and now her posture was tense, as if she were bracing herself. "Leaving already?" Callum asked, drying his hands on a dish towel. Ophelia turned slightly, her expression unreadable. She hesitated, then exhaled. "I appreciate everything you've done, but I should go." Lily, who had been playing nearby, looked up sharply. "Where are you going?" Ophelia's gaze softened as she met the little girl's wide-eyed stare. "I just have some things I need to take care of," Lily pouted. "But you don't have a car." Callum raised an eyebrow at that. He hadn't asked last night, but now that Lily had pointed it out, the question burned in his mind. A woman dressed in luxury, stranded with no vehicle, no luggage, none of it made sense. Ophelia must have sensed his curiosity because she quickly looked away. "I'll figure it out." Callum folded his arms. "You have somewhere to go." She hesitated again. That was answer enough. Lily tugged on Callum's sleeve. "Can she stay a little longer?" Ophelia's jaw tensed. "I don't want to intrude." Callum studied her for a long moment. He wasn't the type to pry, but something about the way she carried herself, the hesitation, the guarded look in her eyes told him she had nowhere to be. "I have to head into town later," he said casually. "If you need a ride somewhere, I can take you." Ophelia searched his face as if trying to decide whether or not to accept. Finally, she nodded. "All right," Lily clapped her hands. "Does that mean you can help me with my puzzle?" Ophelia blinked, caught off guard. "Puzzle?" Lily darted toward the living room, grabbing a half-finished jigsaw puzzle from the coffee table. "This one. It's got lots of pieces, but Daddy says I have to finish it myself." Ophelia hesitated, then crouched down beside the little girl. Callum watched as something shifted in her expression, a quiet warmth that hadn't been there before. "Looks like a tough one," Ophelia murmured. Lily grinned. "You can help a little." For the next hour, Callum worked on a few house repairs while Lily and Ophelia pieced together the puzzle. At first, Ophelia was stiff, as if unsure how to engage, but soon, she was laughing softly as Lily chattered excitedly about school and her favorite bedtime stories. Callum leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't expected Ophelia to linger, let alone connect with Lily so easily. There was something almost wistful in the way she looked at the little girl, like she was seeing something she hadn't had in a long time. By the time the puzzle was complete, Lily beamed with pride. "We did it," Ophelia smiled, a real one this time. "You did most of the work." Lily beamed, then yawned, the morning excitement finally catching up to her. Callum scooped her up, carrying her toward her room for a short nap. When he returned, Ophelia was standing by the window, staring out at the sunlit yard. "You're good with her," Callum said as he walked over. Ophelia's lips pressed together. "She's easy to love." Callum studied her profile. There was something distant in her gaze again, like she was lost in a memory. "Do you have kids?" he asked before he could stop himself. Ophelia's shoulders stiffened. "No," something in her tone told him not to ask further. After a beat of silence, she exhaled and turned toward him. "You're a good father," Callum shrugged. "I try." Ophelia tilted her head slightly. It can't be easy raising a child alone. It's not, he admitted. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. Before he could press further, she straightened. You said you were heading into town, he nodded. Yeah, need to grab some supplies for the diner. Ophelia smoothed down her coat. I'll come with you. Callum grabbed his keys and they headed out. The drive into town was quiet at first, but as they neared the town's main street, Ophelia finally spoke. You own the diner, he nodded. Yeah, been running it for a few years now, she glanced at him. Why a diner? Callum kept his eyes on the road. I wanted something steady. Something that would give Lily a good life. Ophelia was silent for a moment before she murmured, Stability is a rare thing. Callum turned toward her, but her gaze was focused outside. When they reached the town center, Callum parked near the grocery store. As they stepped out, a few locals greeted him warmly, asking about Lily and the diner. Ophelia watched the interactions with quiet curiosity. You know everyone here, she observed as they walked inside. Callum chuckled. Small town. People look out for each other. Ophelia trailed her fingers over a display of fresh produce, her expression unreadable. As they moved through the aisles, Callum noticed how she hesitated before picking up anything, as if unfamiliar with the routine of shopping for herself. When they reached the checkout, she glanced at the register, then quickly stepped back, letting Callum pay without protest. Once they were back outside, Callum leaned against the truck. You don't do this often, do you? Ophelia stilled. Do what? Grocery shopping, small town life. Her jaw tightened slightly before she let out a slow breath. No. I don't. Callum watched her carefully. You running from something. Ophelia's gaze snapped to his, something guarded flickering in her eyes. Before she could answer, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver, a sharply dressed man, stepped out and strode toward them with purpose. Miss Lancaster. His voice was clipped, urgent. Callum felt something in his chest tighten. Lancaster. Why did that name sound familiar? Ophelia's expression hardened. How did you find me? The man ignored the question, his gaze flickering toward Callum before returning to her. Your father has been looking for you. A cold silence settled between them. Callum frowned. Your father, Ophelia exhaled sharply, then turned to face him fully. Callum, she hesitated, then sighed. I wasn't exactly honest with you. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. The man stepped forward. Miss Lancaster, the family is waiting. Ophelia's hands clenched at her sides. Callum's jaw tightened. Who are you really? She met his gaze, and for the first time since he'd met her, the walls in her eyes cracked just a little. My name is Ophelia Lancaster, she said quietly, and I'm not just passing through. Callum stood rigid, his grip tightening around the grocery bag he still held. The weight of Ophelia's revelation settled heavily between them, thickening the already tense air. He had known there was something about her that didn't quite fit, but this was beyond what he'd expected. Ophelia Lancaster. The name echoed in his mind, and suddenly it clicked. Lancaster, as in the family that owned half the East Coast, the name stamped on luxury hotels, private estates, and high-end businesses. He had seen it in magazines, on news headlines. Ophelia wasn't just wealthy, she was part of an empire. And she had been in his home, playing puzzles with his daughter, eating pancakes at his kitchen table. The man who had arrived to retrieve her stood waiting impatiently, his sharp gaze flickering between them. Miss Lancaster, we should leave now. Ophelia didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Callum, searching his face as if bracing for his reaction. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. So, what was all of this? Just running away from your life for a little while. Her expression faltered. I wasn't running away. Then what were you doing? His tone wasn't harsh, but there was no mistaking the edge of disappointment beneath it. Ophelia's hands clenched at her sides. I needed to breathe, to be somewhere where I wasn't just, she stopped, shaking her head. I didn't expect to end up at your diner. I didn't expect any of this. Callum studied her, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her jaw set with quiet frustration. He could see it now, the weight she carried, the expectations that had likely followed her every step since birth. But that didn't change the fact that she had kept the truth from him. "You should go," he said finally, his voice quieter now, something in her gaze fractured. Callum, the man beside her, took a step forward. "Miss Lancaster," she lifted a hand, silencing him. "Just a moment." Turning back to Callum, she hesitated before speaking again. "I didn't lie to you. I didn't know how to tell you." He held her gaze, searching for something he wasn't sure what, but before he could say anything else, she stepped back. "I'll go," she murmured. "But this wasn't nothing to me." Then, without another word, she turned and climbed into the sleek black car. Callum watched as the vehicle pulled away, disappearing down the street. And just like that, she was gone. The following days passed in a blur. Callum threw himself into work, focusing on the diner, on Lily, on anything that kept his mind from lingering too long on the woman who had vanished from their lives as suddenly as she had appeared. Lily asked about her once, her small voice curious. "Is Miss Ophelia coming back?" Callum had forced a small smile, brushing his fingers through her curls. "I don't think so, sweetheart." But even as he said it, something inside him felt unsettled. He told himself it didn't matter, that she belonged to a world entirely different from his. That whatever had happened between them, whatever connection had sparked, had been fleeting. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, he found himself thinking about her. About the way she had looked at him in those last moments. About the way she had fit so effortlessly into his home, into his life. And he hated that he missed her. Weeks passed before he saw her again. It was late evening, the diner just about to close. Callum was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. He turned, expecting a late-night customer. Instead, Ophelia stood in the entrance, her posture hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she'd be welcome. Callum set the rag down slowly. "Didn't expect to see you again." She let out a small breath. "I wasn't sure if I'd come," he crossed his arms. "And yet here you are." She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the tile. This time she wasn't drenched in rain, wasn't shivering from the cold. She was poised, elegant, wearing a tailored coat that screamed wealth, but her eyes were the same. Callum exhaled. "Why are you here, Ophelia?" She hesitated, then spoke. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you." His chest tightened. "I tried," she continued. "I went back to the life I was supposed to live, to the expectations, the business meetings, the decisions I never actually got to make for myself. And all I could think about was a small-town diner and a man who made pancakes for his daughter." Callum swallowed hard. "Ophelia," she took another step closer. "I don't belong in that world, Callum. I never have. And I know it's insane and maybe I'm too late," but she exhaled, her voice quieter now. "I love you." His breath caught. "I love you," she repeated, her gaze unwavering, "and I don't want a life where I have to pretend otherwise." For the first time in weeks, something inside him loosened. He stepped toward her, closing the distance between them. He reached for her slowly, as if making sure she was real. "The last time you were here," he murmured, "you walked away. I won't make that mistake again." Callum studied her for a long moment, searching for doubt. He found none. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he pulled her into his arms. She melted into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as his lips found hers. The kiss was soft at first, then deeper, filled with all the words they hadn't spoken, all the time they had lost. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Does this mean you'll forgive me for keeping the truth from you?" He let out a quiet laugh. "I'll think about it." She smiled, something radiant and relieved. And for the first time since she had left, Callum realized she wasn't just passing through. She was home. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. Ophelia didn't just step into Callum's world, she became part of it. At first, there had been hesitation. Callum wasn't a man who easily let people into his life, not when he had Lily to think about. But Ophelia wasn't just a fleeting presence. She was there in the quiet moments, helping with small tasks at the diner, laughing with Lily as they played in the yard, sitting beside Callum on the porch in the evenings when the world felt still. She had traded sleek black cars and high-rise boardrooms for something simpler, something real. And Callum, despite all his instincts telling him to be cautious, let her in. One evening, as the sun cast a golden glow over the small town, Callum found Ophelia sitting on the porch steps, watching Lily chase fireflies across the yard. There was something peaceful in her expression, a quiet contentment he hadn't seen before. He sat beside her, stretching his legs out. "You look like you belong here." She turned to him, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Maybe I always did." He studied her, the way she had shed the hardened exterior she'd carried when they first met. "You never told me what made you leave your old life," Ophelia sighed, pulling her knees to her chest. "I was supposed to take over my family's company. It wasn't a choice, it was an expectation. Everything in my life was planned, mapped out before I even had a say." She glanced at him. "Then one day I realized I didn't want any of it. I didn't want to wake up every morning feeling like I was living a life someone else had written for me." Callum let her words settle, understanding in a way he hadn't expected. He had built his life from the ground up, not because it was easy, but because it was his. "So you walked away," he murmured. She nodded. "And for the first time I could breathe." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Do you miss it?" Ophelia was quiet for a moment before shaking her head. "No. Not even a little." They sat like that, hand in hand, as Lily giggled in the distance, twirling beneath the fading light. And for the first time in a long time, Callum felt like something in his life had fallen into place. As the weeks stretched into months, Ophelia became woven into the fabric of their lives. She found joy in the mundane, helping at the diner, reading bedtime stories to Lily, learning how to bake from an elderly neighbor who insisted she needed a proper small-town skill. One evening, as Callum locked up the diner, he found her sitting at the counter, flipping through an old notebook. He slid onto the stool beside her. "What's that?" Ophelia hesitated before turning the pages toward him. "I've been working on something." He glanced at the notes, plans, sketches, ideas. "You're opening a business," she nodded. "A bookstore and cafe, something small, something mine." Callum leaned back, impressed. "That's a big step," Ophelia smiled, a flicker of nervous excitement in her eyes. "It feels right." He reached over, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then do it." She exhaled, as if letting go of whatever lingering doubts she had. "I will." And just like that, Ophelia Lancaster, heiress to a billion-dollar empire, was opening a tiny bookstore in the heart of a small town. Months passed, and life settled into something steady, something real. One crisp autumn morning, Callum found himself pacing the backyard, hands shoved into his pockets. He had never been a man prone to nerves, but today was different. Ophelia was inside, helping Lily carve pumpkins at the kitchen table, laughter spilling through the open windows. Callum took a deep breath, pulling the small box from his pocket. He had never imagined himself doing this again, not after everything with Lily's mother. But Ophelia wasn't just another passing love. She was home. That evening, as they sat on the porch, wrapped in the warmth of shared silence, Callum turned to her, heart steady. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he admitted. Ophelia tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Someone like me." He reached for her hand, pressing the box into her palm. "Someone I want to spend forever with." Her breath hitched as she opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. For the first time, Ophelia Lancaster, the woman who had once belonged to a world of excess, was speechless. Callum cupped her face, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "Marry me." Tears brimmed in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes." Lily, who had been peeking from the doorway, let out an excited squeal. "Does this mean Miss Ophelia is staying forever?" Ophelia laughed, pulling her into a warm embrace. Forever. And just like that, the woman who had once been a stranger in the rain had become the heart of their home. The wedding was small, intimate. A gathering of close friends, the town coming together to celebrate something that had felt inevitable from the start. Ophelia wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant, nothing borrowed from the life she had left behind. Callum stood waiting for her beneath an arch of wildflowers. Lily nestled between them as they exchanged vows. When they kissed, the town erupted into cheers, but for Callum and Ophelia, the world had already narrowed down to just them. As they danced beneath the soft glow of string lights, Callum whispered against her ear, "Still think you don't belong here?" Ophelia smiled, pressing a kiss to his lips. "I've never belonged anywhere more." And in that moment, Callum knew this wasn't just a love story. This was forever. The air was crisp with the promise of winter as Callum strolled through town, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The small streets were lined with twinkling lights, warm glows spilling from shop windows as the town prepared for the holiday season. Life had taken on a steady rhythm, one that felt natural, filled with laughter, quiet moments, and a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he had been missing. Ophelia had settled into their world with an ease that still surprised him. The bookstore cafe she had opened had quickly become a favorite among the locals, a cozy space filled with shelves of carefully chosen books and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As Callum walked past the shop's window, he caught sight of her inside, leaning over the counter as she spoke to an elderly woman selecting a book. Her expression was animated, her hands moving as she spoke, completely immersed in the conversation. He lingered for a moment, simply watching. There had been a time when he had thought love was something fleeting, something that slipped through fingers no matter how tightly one tried to hold on. But Ophelia had proven otherwise. She had stayed. She had chosen this life, chosen him, chosen Lily. The realization settled deep in his chest, a warmth spreading through him as he finally stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, drawing Ophelia's attention. When she saw him, her face lit up, the kind of smile that made everything else fade into the background. The elderly woman patted Ophelia's arm before making her way toward the door, offering Callum a knowing glance as she passed. Ophelia moved around the counter, slipping her arms around his waist in a familiar embrace. "You looked lost in thought out there," she murmured. Callum brushed his fingers through her hair, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "Just thinking about how much I love you." Ophelia's breath caught slightly, her grip tightening around him. "You always know how to say the right thing," he chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It's the truth." She sighed softly, resting her head against his chest. "It's been a good day." The shop was busy, and Mrs. Holloway finally found that novel she's been searching for since summer. Callum ran his hands over her back in slow, comforting strokes. "Told you this place would be a success." She pulled back slightly, tilting her head. "I think I just needed to believe it myself." Before he could respond, the door swung open again, and Lily rushed inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Daddy, Miss Ophelia, guess what?" she blurted excitedly. Ophelia knelt, brushing a curl from Lily's face. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily clapped her hands together. "I got to put the star on the big Christmas tree in town square." Callum raised an eyebrow. "How'd you manage that?" Lily grinned. "Mr. Thompson lifted me up. He said I was the perfect helper." Ophelia laughed, pulling her into a tight hug. "That's amazing, Lily. I bet you did a wonderful job." Lily nodded enthusiastically. "Can we go see it tonight?" "Please." Callum glanced at Ophelia before nodding. "I think that sounds like a great idea." That evening, they walked hand in hand through the town square, the towering Christmas tree standing tall in the center, its lights casting a golden glow. Lily beamed with pride, pointing out the star she had placed. Callum wrapped an arm around Ophelia, pulling her close. The scent of pine filled the air, mingling with the distant sound of carolers singing softly in the background. Ophelia leaned into him, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is everything I never knew I wanted." He kissed the top of her head, his gaze fixed on the family they had built together. "Me too." Lily tugged at their hands, pulling them toward a small stand selling hot cocoa. As they stood in line, Callum slipped his fingers through Ophelia's, squeezing gently. He didn't need anything more than this. She was home, she was his. And for the first time in his life, he knew with absolute certainty that love wasn't something fleeting. It was something built, something chosen, something that lasted.